and I was recently contacted by my father after not hearing from him for the past 10 years. 12 years ago, my mom passed away after a long, hard battle with brain cancer. It was a tough time for our family, but just 6 months after she passed, I started noticing that my father would disappear for long periods without telling me where he was going. He would say he was out with friends who weren't even in the city. I got suspicious and decided to follow him one day. I discovered that he was frequently visiting my single aunt's house. My aunt is 3 years younger than my mother and has 2 kids, a son and a daughter slightly older than me from a previous marriage. She got divorced after just a year, and her ex-husband didn't want custody, so she raised the kids with the child support and alimony she received. Money was never a problem for her because her ex-husband was wealthy. My mother and aunt were very close, and my aunt supported my mom until her last breath. So it was shocking to see my dad visiting her. After a few days of following him, I finally mustered the courage to ring her doorbell and find out what was going on. When my aunt opened the door, I confronted them both. I asked why my father had been lying about where he was and why he was visiting my aunt so often. They finally told me they had been in a relationship for the last couple of years since my mother's diagnosis. They hadn't wanted to hurt my mom or stress her out more during her limited time, so they kept their relationship a secret. Now that my mom was gone, they felt they could be together openly. My dad expected me to understand, explaining that it hadn't been easy for him to deal with my mother's condition after so many years together. He said he was already grieving when she was diagnosed and found solace in talking to my aunt, which gradually developed into a relationship. I was obviously pissed and left that day with no intention of ever interacting with my aunt again. They tried to stop me and talk to me, but I just left, telling them they disgusted me and that both of them had betrayed my mother in the worst possible way. I'm not proud of it, but I cursed at both of them before finally going back home. When my dad came home later that evening, he told me my behavior at my aunt's house was unacceptable and that he wasn't okay with me stalking him for the past few days. He expected me to apologize, but I refused. I told him he could continue playing happy family with my aunt because I was moving out and going back to college. I had taken a break from college to be with my father during this tough time, but when I realized he had already found someone, I was so disgusted I didn't want to stay. After I went back to college, my dad sent me an email saying he was selling the house I grew up in and moving in with my aunt. He hoped I would accept that he was trying to move on and be happy, but since I hadn't and hadn't reached out to apologize, he thought we shouldn't interact for a while. He said my aunt and cousins didn't want me to visit them, and he agreed with them, so I was banned from their house. It was unlikely we would see each other anytime soon. That email broke my heart, but it is what it is, and I didn't bother replying to him. My parents and grandparents had set aside a college fund for me, which I got access to when I turned 18, so I didn't have to worry about my expenses. Once I graduated, I started working immediately because I didn't want to rely on my grandparents for money anymore. I was just 20 years old and hoped my father would eventually come to his senses and leave my aunt so we could sort things out. But that never happened. When they went public with their relationship, everyone in my mother's family cut them off, even my grandparents. For the past 10 years, I had no contact with either of them and didn't know what they were up to. I heard they might have moved away, but I was too busy to follow up. Even though I missed my father, I never tried to get in touch with him. About a week ago, I received a call from my father after 10 years of no contact. At first, I didn't recognize the number, so I let it ring. When he called again, I answered, and hearing his voice left me numb. He told me it was very important to talk because he needed my help and had no one else to turn to. He was in a retirement home and had been there for 3 months because of my aunt and her kids who had taken things too far. After going public with their relationship, everyone cut them off, so they moved to the suburbs to get away. Things were fine for a while since her children were grown and only visited once or twice a month, but every time they visited, they took money from my dad and aunt to fund their lifestyle. After a few years, my dad told my aunt he couldn't support this behavior anymore. My aunt insisted that as parents, they should support their children no matter what. After many fights, they agreed that my dad would stop giving money, but my aunt would continue. This went on for a few more years until a few months ago, when her kids demanded an exorbitant amount of money to start their own business. They didn't want to invest their own money, so they asked my aunt and my father to invest. My aunt tried hard to convince him, but he refused until he was sure they could succeed. They had no practical knowledge and didn't even have a proper business model. Their fights escalated, and eventually my aunt decided she didn't want to live with it anymore. Since they were never married and the house belonged to her, she kicked him out. For the past couple of months, he had been living in a retirement home. My cousins were treating him nicely to get money for their investment, but a few weeks ago, they gave him an ultimatum. He had 1 month to decide whether to help with the money, or they would stop paying for his stay, leaving him to find somewhere else to live. Everyone assumed he had a lot of money and was comfortable, but his company had struggled during the pandemic, and he wasn't as wealthy as they thought. There was no way he could come up with the money they were asking for, even if he wanted to. Now he was in a difficult position, losing on both sides, and he didn't know what to do. He called me for help because he thought I was doing well and might buy him something or let him stay with me for a few months. He needed time to figure out a way out of his mess. Even though he said he wouldn't invest in their business, he was sure my cousins would ask him to pay back the amount they had spent on his stay. It was a whole mess, and just hearing about it made me sick. I couldn't believe people could stoop so low. I told my father I needed time to think about it, but honestly, I don't think I can help him. Yes, I'm doing well, but we haven't been in touch for the past 10 years. I don't want to go out of my way to help someone who never bothered to look out for me when it was his turn. So, after telling him I'd think about it, I blocked his number a few days later. I'm already swamped at work and don't need this added stress. Besides, I have my own life to manage and need to save for my future. My boyfriend and I have been together since college, and we're planning to get married in a couple of years. Right now, we're living separately because of his work, but soon enough he will be back and we will be living together. I won't be able to support my father financially or by letting him live with me, so there's no point in helping him now only to kick him out later. Instead of putting him through that, I'm choosing not to help him at all. He can come clean and let everyone know he doesn't have the money they think he does because his company hasn't been doing well. After that, he can use whatever money he has to rent an apartment. I think that's a fair solution. However, after I blocked him, he decided to reach out to my grandparents. Now my grandparents suddenly think I should sort things out with my father before I get married. They believe I should give him a second chance by letting him live with me before he finds an apartment. I find their change in behavior very weird. They have always told me never to forgive my father and my aunt because what they did was unacceptable. Now they think I should make amends with my father and bury the hatchet. It just doesn't make any sense to me. When I tried to argue with them, they made me feel like the bad guy, saying I was being heartless. I'm really confused because if my grandparents approved of my decision, I wouldn't be worried about whether I'm doing the right thing. But now I'm not so sure. I've talked to my boyfriend and he isn't sure either. I don't know what to do, and since this is too personal to share with my friends, I'm here on Reddit to ask if I'm making the right decision. So, AITA for not wanting to help my father after 10 years of no contact. Update. After reading the comments, I decided to stick with my decision. I told my grandparents that I didn't want to help my father and that my decision was final. I'm an adult now, and I don't think I owe it to anyone to help them in their time of trouble, especially since my father never looked out for me. We weren't close when I was younger. He was mostly working, and even when he was home, he never tried to bond with me like a father should. I hoped my mother's diagnosis would bring our family closer since he started taking more time off work to be at home. Unfortunately, his relationship with me didn't change. Instead, he spent that time creating a bond with his sister-in-law. That was his choice, and now I'm making mine. I don't think I owe anything to a man who treated my deceased mother so poorly when she was fighting for her life. It makes me wonder if she had survived, would my father have chosen her or my aunt? According to him, their relationship started right after my mother's diagnosis, but that's all irrelevant now because nothing worked out for him. The only people on his side are my grandparents, and I find that very confusing. I told my grandparents that I'm not going to help him out, and if they want to be mad about it, they are free to do so. It's not going to affect my decision. I have a life ahead of me and can't take on my father as a burden. My choice of words might upset some people, but right now, he is a burden to me. I've discussed everything with my boyfriend, and he thinks I'm doing the right thing. He never sugarcoats things, so I trust his opinion. My conscience is clear, and I don't feel bad about anything. Update. Last week, I texted my grandparents, telling them I didn't want to help my dad and that it was my final decision. They couldn't manipulate or guilt-trip me into changing my mind. For a few days, they didn't try to talk to me and just left my message on read. But today, they decided to visit me in person to try to change my mind. I don't know why they thought it would work, because I made it clear in my message that I didn't want them to stress me out. I'm really busy at work. Anyway, they showed up at my house just as I returned from work, and I was exhausted. I was in no mood to entertain their nonsense, so when they rang the bell, I immediately told them I was very tired and not ready to discuss anything emotionally heavy. Despite my clear reluctance, they insisted on coming inside. They began talking about how upset my father was with me and how they believed I should show more compassion and humanity towards him. Feeling irritated, I decided to let them speak, hoping they'd eventually take the hint and leave. I stayed silent, hoping to avoid a prolonged argument. However, they showed no signs of stopping. They continued talking about my father's distress in the retirement home. A few days ago, my cousins had threatened to kick him out if he didn't pay up for their business demands. With his company struggling, my father had nowhere else to turn. He pleaded with my grandparents to convince me to let him stay with me until he could find a place of his own. Despite the pressure from my grandparents that I was his only hope, I was growing increasingly annoyed. After some time, I realized they weren't going to shut up. I decided to turn the tables and ask them why, if they felt so strongly about the situation, they weren't helping my dad themselves. They had a spare guest room in their house and could afford to take him in, so there was no reason to pass him off to me. They had expressed sympathy for him, but I didn't share their sentiment. The problem they described seemed more like an excuse for him not taking charge of his own life. If he could afford an apartment, he should leave the retirement home and find one. There was no need for him to play the victim when he had the means to turn things around, despite his struggling company. I have no sympathy for those lacking fighting spirit, which seems to be my father's current situation. When I questioned my grandparents about their reluctance to help him, they started making excuses. They claimed it would be awkward due to his past infidelity to their deceased daughter and emotionally draining for them. I was surprised they thought these excuses justified their inaction, especially since his betrayal had also deeply hurt me. When I pointed this out, a heated argument erupted. They accused me of lacking compassion once again, but I was too exhausted to argue further. I made it clear I didn't want to discuss this with them anymore, and they left. I'm not sure if I'll be speaking to them anytime soon. Their behavior seems unreasonable, and I can't understand why they're acting this way. I've made my decision clear to them, and hopefully they won't try to change my mind again. I last spoke to my father 2 months ago, and even my grandparents stopped talking to me. I was feeling pretty lonely since my boyfriend wasn't around much, only visiting once or twice every couple of weeks. But a few days ago, he moved back here, finishing his project. Now we're officially engaged and ready to start preparing for the wedding, which is happening at the beginning of next year. We have just 7 or 8 months to go. We announced our engagement on social media yesterday, with a picture of my ring and some photos of us hugging. My grandparents aren't on social media, but I'm sure someone told them about it. Since there was a party, they must have found out, but they didn't even congratulate me. My fiancé threw an engagement party last night. He took me out for a drive in the evening, and I guessed he was going to propose, though I wasn't exactly sure what to expect. We went to a romantic spot that meant a lot to us, and that's where he proposed. On the way back home, he told me he had also organized a party in our honor and invited all our friends and family, at least those on good terms with us. When we got home, I changed into something nice, and we headed to the restaurant to spend the rest of the night with our loved ones. My grandparents had been invited, and my fiancé said they had always been there for us during the past 10 years, despite our differences. He wanted them to be present, but they rejected the invitation. He didn't want to break my heart yesterday, so we didn't discuss it. But this morning, when I talked about it and expressed my disappointment that my grandparents hadn't attended my engagement party or congratulated me afterward, he finally told me the truth. I had assumed he hadn't invited them given our strained relationship, but to learn they were invited and chose not to come was humiliating. I can't understand why they're suddenly so passionate about helping my father. It doesn't make sense. But I guess cutting me off is worth it to them. To each their own, I suppose. Update 4. Hey everyone, I'm getting married in a month, and the invitations have been sent out. My grandparents didn't receive one because a couple of weeks ago, I finally figured out why they were so keen on me helping my father. My dad and I hadn't been in touch since our last phone call when I decided not to help it and blocked him instead. He reached out a couple of weeks ago with an email explaining everything. It turns out my grandparents had known about my aunt's affair with my father from the beginning. As soon as they started dating, she confessed to them. They advised her not to tell my mom, who was battling cancer, to spare her the pain. They maintained a facade of disdain toward my aunt and dad over the past 10 years to avoid alienating me. This betrayal shattered my trust in them, and I'm relieved they're no longer in my life. They deserve each other. My father had manipulated my grandparents into pressuring me to help him. When their efforts failed, he decided to reveal the truth and sent me proof via email. It's shaken me deeply to realize I've been living a lie for the past decade. Coping with this isn't easy, but focusing on the upcoming wedding helps distract me. After that, my fiancé and I are looking forward to our honeymoon, which I hope will help me move on for good. I'm incredibly grateful to have such a supportive partner by my side through